You were never supposed to hear this. Not in daylight, not in the quiet of your room, not anywhere. Because once you do, you will never sit at a table the same way again. The year is 1662. The forests of Central Europe carried whispers the church dared not write down, whispers of a village that fed itself on the flesh of strangers, a place where weary travelers, desperate for bread and shelter, walked willingly into their own graves. Imagine it, a smiling host at the doorway, warm bread on the table, wine poured into your cup, and silence, too much silence, the kind that drowns out your instincts until it's too late. History never gave them a name. The records, those that survived, were burned, smudged, erased. But fragments remain, fragments that speak of a feast where no guest ever left, where the villagers lived by a covenant older than the church, darker than scripture. You see, hunger alone does not explain this. Famine scars a land, yes, but famine does not turn men into ritualists. These villagers were not merely starving peasants, they were something else. Something bound to an agreement written not on parchment, but in blood. And here is the question no historian dares to answer. Why were their victims always outsiders? Why were no villagers ever consumed? Because it wasn't about food, it was about power. Power drawn from silence. The silence of the guest who never screamed, the silence of the earth that swallowed the bones, the silence of centuries that kept this truth buried. Tonight, you step into that silence with me, and once you do, you will never unhear what I am about to tell you. So lean in, listen carefully. The feast is about to begin. The first records surfaced not in the village itself, but in the diary of a soldier. He wrote of a winter march, of frostbitten nights, of stumbling into a settlement where the chimneys all smoked, yet no sound of livestock, no barking dogs, no children crying, just a silence that pressed against his skull. The villagers welcomed him. They smiled too much, bowed too deeply, insisted he sit at their long wooden table. The bread was warm, the stew was thick, the wine was heavy. But the soldier noticed something odd. No one else ate. Every villager stared as he raised the spoon. Their eyes glittered in the firelight as though his hunger were their entertainment. He never finished that entry. The page ends with a single smudge of ink, a line that begins mid-word and trails off like a throat closing. His body was never recovered. His diary was found years later, buried in the mud outside the village. What was left of the settlement told a story darker than famine. Cellars stacked with bones, stripped clean but arranged carefully, almost reverently. Jaws placed in circles, ribs lined like altars, and on the walls carved deep into the wood, a pattern repeated again and again, a circle split by a single vertical line. Historians call it meaningless, a peasant's idle scratch, but they lie. That symbol predates Christianity, it predates Rome, it is the mark of silence itself, the seal used by ancient cults to bind agreements with forces that fed not on food, but on submission. And this is where the sickness spreads, because silence is not just the absence of sound, it is control, it is domination, it is the death of resistance before resistance even begins. The villagers of 1662 understood something the world has forgotten. When a man eats another man, he does not just consume his flesh, he consumes his will, and those who consume enough will never hunger again. So ask yourself, how many feasts had already been held before the world finally noticed? Silence was their altar, flesh was their offering. But the villagers of 1662 were not unique. They were not an accident of history. They were a mirror, a reflection of something far older, something that has never truly ended. The church called it heresy, the crown called it treason, but both institutions in their own ways copied it. Think carefully. What is confession but the forced silence of guilt? What is taxation but the quiet taking of flesh in another form? You may not hear the screams, but the exchange is the same. A body is drained, a spirit subdued, and the silence that follows is called order. The villagers had simply made it literal. They removed the mask. They understood that control requires ritual. That ritual requires sacrifice, and that sacrifice requires silence, not the silence of peace, the silence of submission, The silence of a man who knows he cannot fight back, who knows his fate is sealed, who accepts his own consumption without a word. That symbol carved into their walls, the circle split by a single line, was more than art. It was the blueprint. The circle was the community, the closed loop where no member was ever harmed. The line was the division, the outsider who carried the weight, the one chosen to feed the many. Every society since then has carried that pattern. Some hide it behind religion, some disguise it in law, some dress it in economics. But the design never changes, a circle protected, and a line sacrificed. And here's the secret that gnaws at history. Those villagers were never punished. The records simply stop. No executions, no trials, just disappearance. As though an agreement was made, as though the authorities looked into that circle and chose to remain silent. Do you see it now? This was never about hunger. It was about the oldest form of power, deciding who eats and who is eaten. And if you think that Tool died in a burned-out village centuries ago, look around. Every institution you obey is still feeding on silence, still deciding who belongs to the circle and who will be carved out by the line. It said, the church thought it erased them. The crown thought it buried them, but power never destroys what works. It only adopts it. The villagers of 1662 had stumbled onto something terrifyingly effective, the ability to bind a community through ritual silence. And when the rulers of Europe heard whispers of it, they did what rulers always do. They stole it, refined it, and scaled it until entire nations were swallowed without a sound. Consider this. When the Inquisition silenced heretics, they did not just kill bodies. They erased names, burned books, buried voices. Silence became law, and when kings demanded loyalty through taxes, they called it duty. But the hunger was the same. One circle protected, one line sacrificed. The language changed, but the covenant remained. The villagers had eaten flesh. Empires learned to eat memory. Look closely at history's patterns. Revolts crushed before songs could be sung, rebellions erased from chronicles, names of the disobedient struck out as though they never lived. Silence is more than censorship. It is ritualized disappearance. The same feast those villagers performed in secret huts, now carried out in palaces and courts. And here lies the most disturbing truth. Silence feeds power more reliably than blood ever could. Flesh rots, bones crumble, but silence multiplies. A single silenced man becomes a dozen silenced households. A dozen silenced households become a nation too afraid to speak. And in that hush, power grows fat, patient, eternal. The symbol on the villagers' walls, the circle and the line, was not burned away by time. It was absorbed. It became the hidden architecture of control. Nations protect their own circle, but always choose a line, a group, a class, a stranger, a scapegoat, to be offered in silence. And if you are still listening, still awake, you already feel the weight of the question pressing against you, who is being offered today. Because the feast has never ended, the table is still set, and silence is still the prayer. Think back to that village in 1662. The outsider sat at the table. Bread was placed before him, wine poured into his cup, eyes staring as he raised the spoon. He thought he was a guest. He thought he was safe. He thought the silence was comfort. That illusion is the core of control. Silence is not just absence of sound. It is programming. It teaches the victim not to resist, to trust the host, to believe the ritual is ordinary life. And once the mind accepts silence as normal, the body can be devoured without struggle. This is not folklore. This is psychology. Today they call it conditioning. Break a man with violence and he will resist. Break him with silence and he will obey. Because silence does not feel like an attack, it feels like nothing at all. Look at the world around you. Schools demand silence before obedience. Workplaces demand silence before loyalty. Courts demand silence before judgment. Men are taught from the earliest age that silence is virtue. Speak too much, resist too loudly, and you are cast outside the circle. Stay quiet, nod, comply. and you are fed to the system smiling. This is why those villagers never ate their own. Their silence was not punishment, it was communion. They bound themselves in secrecy, protected their circle, and trained every child to understand one law. Outsiders are the feast. And here's the sickness. That law did not die in the mud of 1662. It lives in every hierarchy you serve. Why are some men silenced while others are given the stage? Why are some voices erased while others are amplified? Because silence is rationed, because silence is the invisible weapon that marks the difference between who eats and who is eaten. And the most disturbing part, you have already tasted this. Every time you swallowed your words in the presence of power, every time you stayed quiet to protect your job, your family, your safety, every time you knew the truth but refused to speak it, you were sitting at that table spoon in hand, unaware you were the meal. The villagers discovered the design, institutions perfected it, and now the question burns, how much of you has already been consumed? When the village vanished from records, the silence did not end. It spread. It was carried not by peasants but by men in robes, men in crowns, men who sat in candlelit chambers designing futures for others to obey. You've heard of them, though rarely by name. Brotherhoods, councils, secret orders that claimed to guard civilization while feeding on it. Their weapon was never the sword nor the fire. It was silence. A silence enforced not by threat but by belief. Understand this. Fear fades, terror weakens, but silence lingers like a chain no man feels until he tries to move. These orders knew what the villagers had discovered. To rule, you must feast in silence. That meant erasing dissent before it became speech, binding men in oaths they could never break, demanding rituals that stripped individuality until nothing remained but obedience. Consider the monasteries where novices were sworn into silence for years. Consider the courts where secrets were locked behind symbols, whispered only in shadows. Consider the initiation rites of guilds, masons, and councils where one broken vow of silence meant death. Was this faith? Or was this the same feast continued on a grander scale? The villagers consumed bodies. These institutions consumed identities. They learned that if you force a man into silence long enough, he forgets he ever had a voice. His will collapses, and he becomes a vessel, a tool, a servant, a loyal body offered to the circle. And this is why history remembers so little of the village itself. Because it was never meant to be remembered. The silence was too valuable. It was absorbed, reforged, institutionalized. By the time the Enlightenment rose, the silence had already built its throne. By the time revolutions broke across Europe, the silence had already chosen who would lead and who would fall. And by the time you were born, it had already written the script of your life, what you can say, what you cannot, and who will decide the difference. The circle remains, the line remains, the feast continues. And if you believe the silence does not touch you, wait until you notice how often your words die before they reach your tongue. That is not hesitation, that is not fear, that is programming. The villagers lit the fire, the orders kept it burning, and today the world is still warm with its glow. Listen, the feast moved from huts to lecture halls, from cellars to classrooms, and it learned to dress itself as progress. The same design, only cleaner. The same bargain, only legal. Where once a stranger was ushered to a table and never left, now a boy is ushered into a schoolroom and never learns to trust his own voice. Where once a secret order bound an oath with blood, now a curriculum binds a promise with grades and diplomas. The mechanism is the same. Ritualize obedience, reward silence, and make the act feel honorable. They taught compliance as virtue. They taught submission as wisdom. They taught the line between the circle and the outsider as inevitable law, not a choice. You were given boxes to tick, tests to pass, loyalties to display. And every successful submission carved another notch into the architecture that keeps the feast going. This is psychological warfare disguised as education. It is conditioning masquerading as upbringing. Religion, too, learned to hum the same low tone. Confession became a tool not merely of forgiveness, but of surveillance. Piety became a method to teach men to carry shame like ballast, so their voices would sink before they ever rose. Pray quietly. Do not question. The ritual binds, and the bound forget they are bound. Politics sharpened the blade. Policies, laws, and elections became ceremonies where the chosen keep the circle intact and the chosen outside the line remain convenient offerings. The public learns to fear chaos, to accept small losses for the promise of stability, and in that exchange gives away the right to name the feast's victims. The people who scream loudest are dismissed as dangerous. The ones who kneel quietly are called civilized. The ritual continues, now in chambers, now in screen-lit feeds, but the pattern is unchanged. And do not mistake technology for liberation. Technology is simply a moan, re-efficient altar. Algorithms pick who will be amplified and who will be erased. Data becomes the new bone pile, arranged, catalogued, used to predict who will bend and who will break. The village's circle and line live inside these servers. The feast is anonymized, sanitized, and therefore more effective. You obey because the machine says so, and you do not hear yourself obey because the machine hums in a register too low for your fear to notice. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. The village taught us a grammar of domination, and modern institutions learn to speak it fluently. Once you see the grammar, you can begin to unlearn the language they taught you. Once you know the ritual, you can refuse to be the ingredient. But refusal requires voice, and voice is the one thing the feast always hunts. So pay attention. The ceremony is everywhere. The table is set in places you trust. The silence is taught like a lesson. And the only way out of that architecture is to learn to speak when every system tells you to be quiet. Now that you see the architecture, it's time to learn its instruments. The small, precise methods the feast uses to train compliance until it becomes invisible. This section is not a lecture. It's a field manual whispered into your ear, tiny recognitions that reveal a system pretending to be ordinary life. Notice them, and the ritual loses its power. First, the slowing of conversation. In every room that matters, there is a moment where speech is trimmed, clipped, softened, where the questions that threaten the circle are politely rerouted. You will feel it as a cooling of willingness, an automatic smoothing of edges, a sudden preference for consensus over truth. Hard questions are labeled divisive. Discomfort is marketed as instability. That is the first test. Could you ask what everyone else avoids? If not, you've already accepted the rule of silence. Second, the ritualized apology. Watch how often power demands contrition, not for wrongdoing, but for curiosity. "I'm sorry if this offends" becomes the preemptive shackle. It trains you to preempt your own voice with humility, to reduce your claims before the argument even begins. The feast uses that apology like salt. Once you taste it, your speech becomes preservative, harmless, non-threatening, consumable. Third, the slow normalization of exceptions. Each time they carve a necessary hole in the law, a new line of outsiders is created. First, it's a tax here, a secret there, a pardon for the right people. Then norms shift and the circle grows protection while the line grows victims. The ritual of incrementalism is the feast's favorite spoon. Small repeated measures that never alarm the appetite until the table is full. Fourth, the language of invisibility. Euphemisms exist to hide the act of taking. Resource reallocation, strategic realignment, temporary measures, these phrases do the work of cut-in. See the words that could name the sacrifice. Learn to translate them back into plain language. What is resource reallocation but someone's hunger paid by someone else's silence? Fifth, the spectacle of scapegoating. The feast needs faces to focus outrage away from itself. It picks a stranger, amplifies fear, and the crowd cheers while the table is prepared. You'll see it in headlines, in viral outrage, in political theater. Outrage is the show. Silence is the backstage agreement. These instruments are simple because human minds are simple when trained. They work not because people are monstrous, but because we are taught to accept rituals that feel safer than resistance. Your task is not to become belligerent. It is to identify these tools in the wild and refuse their pattern. Name the slowing of conversation when you feel it. Refuse the preemptive apology. Translate euphemisms into truthful nouns. Refuse scapegoating as moral clarity. Every refusal is a small wound to the feast. Small wounds accumulate. A man who refuses once is more likely to refuse twice. Refusal is contagious, and that contagion is the opposite of silence. It is noise that wakes others. Keep your eyes open. Keep your voice measured but loud enough to disturb the ritual. That is how you begin to unlearn obedience. There have always been men who broke the silence. They did not plan grand revolutions. They simply refused the ritual in a single human moment. A whisper in a corridor, a letter slipped beneath a door, a name spoken where everyone else nodded away. Those small ruptures looked insignificant at first. They were dismissed, ridiculed, punished. But they carried contagion. One voice makes room for another. One admission cracks the varnish of consensus. History remembers few of them because the feast remembers everyone. The circle learned how to hunt the noisy. It developed a repertoire. Erase the name, discredit the witness, spread rumors, buy silence with favors, or break a man publicly so the rest learn caution. When noise threatens the table moves fast. The village burned victims discreetly. Empires used courts, pamphlets, and closets. The instruments change, but the intent is the same. Protect the circle by removing the thorn. Yet removal never fully succeeds. The story of resistance is strewn with men who survived the purge not by hiding, but by becoming clearer. They turned their punishment into signal. When they were slandered, they named the slanderers. When exiled, they taught others outside the circle to speak. When books were burned, they learned to hide pages inside other pages. In the shadow of the feast, men learned craft, how to encode truth in parables, how to pass knowledge through songs and smithing, how to plant quiet rebellions that ripened into uprisings. Listen to the pattern. The circle fears replication. It fears that the method of binding will be taught back to the masses, so it does everything to keep knowledge brittle and personal. But the human impulse to share is stronger than any secrecy oath. One man's whispered dissent becomes another man's manual for refusal. The feast eats bodies. It cannot eat murmurs once they find root. This is why the hunted are both tragic and dangerous. Tragedy makes martyrs. Danger makes teachers. A man who loses everything often learns how little the system can actually take from him. Stripped of status, he becomes lucid. He sees the architecture clearly, the rituals, the euphemisms, the staged outrages, and he can teach you how to resist without heroics, by naming the euphemism, by refusing the staged apology, by refusing to be the scapegoat. If you want to be dangerous in the right way, learn from the erased. Their methods are simple and stubborn. Speak truth where it matters. Build small circles that don't mimic the feast. Pass codes that cannot be easily consumed. The feast can erase names from ledgers, but it cannot unteach a man how to speak. Keep that in mind as you step forward. Resistance is not a war of armies. It is a contagion of speech. Be the carrier. They told the townspeople the boy was cursed, but curses rarely linger on one soul alone. They infect every hand that tries to hold them. The neighbors began whispering, "Don't let your children near him. Don't let them stare into his eyes." Mothers tugged their daughters away when he passed. Fathers pressed rosaries into their palms. But fear has a strange way of breeding fascination. At night, while the boy sat in silence by the cracked hearth, children from the village would creep to the Hale property, pressing their faces to the broken slats of the barn to catch a glimpse. What they saw sent them running home, screaming. The boy never moved his lips, yet the air around him hummed, as though something beneath the earth was speaking through him. The walls of the barn would shudder, as if struck by invisible fists. The cows inside grew sick, their eyes turning pale before they collapsed in the hay. When the preacher came, clutching his worn Bible, he placed it on the boy's chest to test if he carried the devil's mark. The boy did not flinch, but the pages yellowed and curled as if fire licked at them from inside. The preacher dropped the book and fled, his voice breaking. "He is not of God. He is not of man." From then on, the boy was not spoken of in the pastures or the markets. He became a shadow, a story to frighten restless children. But Tobias Hale knew the truth better than anyone. His son was no mere boy without a pulse. His son was becoming something else, something older than the soil itself. And every night, as the moon hung low, Tobias swore he could hear his wife's voice again, not in his dreams, but whispering from the boy's throat. Would you like me to carry this transformation further in the next section, where the boy starts to display powers that unsettle even Tobias himself? It began with small things Tobias told himself could be explained if only he tried hard enough. One morning the water in the well was black, not muddy, not dirty, black as if ink had replaced the earth's veins. Tobias dipped a bucket, and when the liquid touched his skin it burned with a cold so sharp he dropped it screaming. The boy only watched, unblinking, his pale eyes glinting in the dawn. That same week, the chickens stopped laying eggs. Then the trees nearest the farmhouse shed their leaves, though it was not yet autumn. Tobias knew the land better than anyone. He had turned dry soil into crops before, pulled life out of barrenness. But this was no act of weather, nor the hand of God. This was his son. At night, Tobias would wake to the sound of voices murmuring outside his window. Not men, not thieves. He recognized the tone. It was his wife's voice, rising from the boy's throat, layered with countless others. Tobias would creep to the doorframe and see him standing in the field, arms outstretched, whispering to the horizon, and the wind would answer. The boy did not eat, not anymore. Food would rot in the bowl before he touched it. Yet he grew taller, his skin stretching thin over his bones. His veins glowed faintly in the dark, like cracks of lightning trapped beneath the flesh. Still, Tobias could not abandon him. Every night he told himself, "He is my blood, he is my son." But deep inside, another voice pressed against his skull, a thought he dared not speak. Or perhaps he is only wearing my son's body. And then came the night the animals rose from their pens, as if summoned by a call only they could hear. They did not run. They circled the boy in silence, eyes wide, waiting. That was when Tobias knew. This was no curse. This was a gathering. Do you want the next section to reveal the first violent act caused by the boy's presence, something that makes the town realize they can no longer ignore him? It happened on a night when the moon was full, swollen like a pale wound in the sky. Tobias had been dozing in his chair, the fire snapping low, when he heard the sound, a scream, sharp, ragged, not far from his fields. He bolted upright, and before he could reach for his lantern, the boy was already at the door, standing there, motionless, waiting. The scream came again. This time Tobias recognized the voice, his neighbor's daughter. No more than 12 years old. She had taken the path home too late, her lantern extinguished by the wind. Tobias rushed outside, his heart battering against his ribs. The night air smelled wrong, iron and smoke. He found her near the tree line, frozen in place. Her face was tilted upward, eyes wide, mouth open, but no sound came out anymore. Above her, every branch of the oak was filled with crows. Hundreds of them, pressed so tight their feathers shifted like black waves. And standing just beyond her, at the edge of the forest, was the boy, his son. His face expressionless, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He didn't move, didn't speak, yet the crows bent their heads toward him as if awaiting command. The girl's body convulsed, lifted an inch off the ground, then slammed down again. Tobias ran forward, shouting her name, but it was too late. Her chest caved inward with a sickening crack, as though unseen hands had crushed the breath out of her. The crows exploded from the trees all at once, blotting out the moon. When the feathers cleared, the boy was gone. The girl lay twisted in the dirt, her lantern shattered beside her. The villagers found her before dawn. They whispered of devils, of witches, of debts unpaid. And though no one said his name aloud, their eyes slid toward Tobias's farm. That morning, Tobias found his son back in bed, silent, staring at the ceiling. His lips barely moved, but Tobias heard the words clear as eye. If they had been whispered directly into his skull, "She was the first, there will be more." Would you like me to make the next section about how the villagers begin to turn against Tobias, suspecting the boy, but fearing him too much to confront him directly? The girl's death spread like fire in dry grass. By sunrise, the village was already whispering. By noon, they were pointing. By dusk, they were knocking on Tobias's door. They came in groups, lanterns swaying, eyes burning with fear disguised as anger. They didn't say his son's name, not once. They didn't have to. Every question was a blade hidden in a prayer. "Tobias," they asked, "did you hear the screams? Tobias, was your boy out that night? Tobias, what kind of things does he do when no one is watching?" He gave them nothing. What could he say? That his son spoke in his wife's voice, that crows bent to his will, that a child's chest had caved in with no hand upon it. If Tobias opened his mouth, the truth would not save him, it would damn him. But the villagers saw enough in his silence. They left him standing in his doorway, lantern light flickering across their faces like masks of judgment. When they were gone, the night seemed heavier, thicker, as though the boy's shadow had stretched to cover the whole farm. That same evening, Tobias went to check the barns. He found them empty. The villagers had taken his animals, his cows, his pigs, his chickens, every living thing that had once given his land purpose. They had stolen them in silence, not out of spite but out of fear, as if even beasts carried away from his soil might escape the curse. Inside, the boy sat at the table, unmoving, his pale eyes reflecting the candle's flame. Tobias slammed his fist down, demanding to know what he had done, what he was. The boy finally spoke. His voice was calm, unshaken yet layered, his wife's tone laced beneath his own. "They will turn against you, father. Not because of what I've done, but because of what I will do." Tobias's breath caught. For the first time he felt not only fear, but a flicker of something else, a pull, a dark current in the boy's words, tugging at the part of Tobias that was too tired to fight. That night, Tobias dreamed of fire in the village square and faces chanting his name. But the flames weren't for him. They were for the boy. Would you like the next section to show how the villagers secretly plan to destroy the boy, while Tobias struggles between protecting his blood and fearing what he has unleashed? The village elders met in secret, though secrecy was impossible in a place where eyes lingered too long and doors creaked at the wrong hour. Still they gathered, in the church cellar, beneath the rotting beams and the flicker of a single candle. The girl's death had broken something in them. Fear no longer whispered, it screamed. The boy was no longer a curiosity, no longer a pity. He was a threat, and threats, they said, must be dealt with. They spoke in low tones, masking their words behind scripture. "If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out," murmured the pastor. Another answered, "If rot spreads in the harvest, the field must be burned." These were not verses anymore. They were instructions. But still, none dared speak plainly. To name the boy aloud felt like summoning him, so they called him the shadow, the mark, the thorn in the flesh. Their fear wrapped around their courage like chains, yet at last a decision was made. When the next full moon rose, they would end him. No trial, no blessing, just fire, rope, and silence. Word spread quietly like smoke under a door. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men sharpened tools not for the fields, but for something darker. Even the women who once brought Tobias bread now crossed themselves when he passed. The boy was already condemned. Only the flames had not yet touched him. And Tobias knew. He saw it in the way their gazes shifted, in the sudden absence of voices when he entered the tavern. He smelled it in the air, the scent of men preparing for violence, the way wolves circle before a kill. That night, as he returned home, he found the boy standing at the edge of the field. The wind whipped his hair, though the air was still. His eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, fixed on the village below. "They are planning," the boy said without turning. "They believe their whispers are hidden. They are not. I hear them." Tobias swallowed, his throat dry. "And what will you do?" The boy finally looked at him, lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. "What I was born to do." Would you like the next section to show the first night of confrontation, when the villagers make their move, and Tobias must choose whether to defend his son or surrender him? The night of the full moon arrived like a blade sliding from its sheath, silent, inevitable. The village below Tobias's farm was restless, though no church bell rang. No horn was sounded. Instead, men moved like shadows between houses, carrying torches wrapped in cloth, axes tucked against their sides, ropes coiled around their arms. This was not justice. This was ritual, a cleansing by fire. Tobias sat in his darkened house, the weight of silence pressing against his chest. His son was not in bed. He hadn't been for hours. The boy had vanished into the night, leaving no sound of footsteps, no trace of movement. Only the faint smell of smoke lingered in his room, as if the fire had already begun. Then Tobias heard it. The crunch of boots in the soil, the murmur of men, the sharp whinny of horses tethered near his fence. The villagers had come. They did not knock. They surrounded his house, the glow of their torches seeping through the cracks in the shutters. One voice called out, harsh and commanding, "Tobias, hail! Bring out the boy! Do not make us drag him into the light!" For a moment, Tobias thought of opening the door, of handing his son over, of ending this terror in one single brutal act. The thought slithered into him like poison. Give them the boy, and save yourself. But then he heard it, a whisper, not outside, not within, inside his skull. His wife's voice, soft and familiar, carried through the boy's tongue. They do not want him, Tobias. They want you to betray your own blood. That is the true test. The whisper swelled until it drowned out his own thoughts, and Tobias gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The men outside shouted again, pounding on the door, their voices louder, sharper, cracking under fear disguised as fury. Before Tobias could move, a scream tore through the night. One of the men at the edge of the field dropped, his torch clawing at his chest, his body bending backward at an unnatural angle until his spine snapped like dry wood. The villagers froze, terror rooting them in place. And from the tree line the boy emerged, pale, calm, his eyes brighter than the firelight. He walked as though he had been waiting for this moment since the day he was born. And Tobias, watching from the doorway, realized the villagers had not come to destroy the boy. No, they had come to awaken him. Would you like the next section to escalate into the massacre of the villagers, where the boy unleashes what he truly is, and Tobias must decide whether to flee or stand by his son? The boy stepped into the circle of torchlight, and the night bent around him. The villagers, hardened men who had swung axes at wolves and buried their own dead, felt their courage melt like wax. Still, one of them lunged, rope in hand, muttering a prayer through clenched teeth. The boy did not flinch. He only raised his eyes, and the man's prayer caught in his throat. His jaw locked, his tongue swelled, and in a blink his body crumpled, lifeless before it struck the earth. Panic rippled through the crowd. Torches wavered, voices broke into screams. Some ran for the horses, others charged forward in blind rage, too afraid to retreat. But the boy lifted his hands, small, delicate, almost fragile. The torches sputtered and died, one after another, plunging the field into darkness. Then came the sound. Not a roar, not thunder. Something worse. A deep, endless hum that seemed to rise from the soil itself, vibrating through bone and marrow. Men clutched their ears, but it was inside them, crawling under their skin. Their own hearts began to beat in unison with the hum until, one by one, they burst. The field became a graveyard in minutes. Bodies sprawled, faces twisted, eyes wide open and staring at a sky that refused to look back. The silence that followed was heavier than the screams. And yet, not all of them died. A few remained standing, paralyzed, trembling, but alive. The boy moved among them, touching their foreheads with a tenderness that mocked the horror he had unleashed. Each touch left a mark, a blackened vein stretching across their skin, spreading like ink in water. Tobias stumbled forward, choking on the stench of blood and smoke. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "For the love of God, stop!" The boy turned to him, eyes glowing with something beyond human. His voice carried both innocence and authority, layered with tones that did not belong to him. "They came to destroy me, Father, but now they belong to me." The surviving villagers fell to their knees, their eyes vacant, their mouths whispering in unison words Tobias could not understand. Ancient words, words not meant for mortal tongues. Tobias's legs gave out. He fell into the dirt, staring at the slaughter, at the husks of men he had known his whole life, neighbors, friends, now twisted into servants of his son. The night was over. The village was broken, and Tobias realized the truth he had been running from since the boy was born. This was not a child. This was an heir to something older, darker, unkillable. Would you like the next section to reveal how the boy consolidates his control over the surviving villagers, turning them into a silent cult that obeys him, while Tobias struggles with the impossible choice of killing his son or submitting to him? By dawn, the village no longer belonged to itself. The survivors who had bent before the boy did not return to their homes. They did not weep for their dead, nor call for the pastor to anoint the bodies. They gathered in silence at the edge of Tobias's field, waiting. Their faces were pale, their eyes unfocused, their lips cracked from whispering the same phrase over and over, words that made Tobias's stomach churn, though he could not translate them. The boy stood among them like a shepherd among sheep. He did not smile, did not gloat. He simply was, and that was enough to bend them. His presence pulled at them like the tide pulls at the moon, and as the sun crept up, they shielded their eyes, not from the light, but as if the light itself no longer held authority over them. By midday, the village square was a monument to silence. The bodies of the dead remained where they had fallen, not buried, not mourned, but left to rot beneath the watch of the boy's new flock. The church bell did not ring. The pastor's house stood open, its door swinging gently in the breeze, but he was nowhere to be found. Tobias staggered through the carnage, hollow-eyed, his mind fracturing under the weight of what he saw. These were men he had grown up with, women who had once shared bread with his family, children who had played with his tools when they were too young to work. Now they bowed to his son as if he were both king and executioner. And yet, deep inside him, a different thought stirred. A dangerous one. For if his boy could bend men so easily, could stop hearts and silence prayers, then perhaps he was not merely a curse, perhaps he was a weapon. The boy approached him at dusk. His pale face was streaked with soot, his veins faintly glowing beneath the skin. "Father," he said softly, his voice carrying like a commandment, "you have lived among men long enough to know they cannot be trusted. They fear what they cannot control. But now, fear is ours to command." Tobias's lips trembled, the words clawing their way out of him. "You ask me to rule beside you, as if this slaughter was a throne." The boy's eyes narrowed, unblinking. "No, Father, I ask you to kneel, for if you do not, you will stand alone, and no man survives alone." That night, Tobias lay awake, staring at the beams above him, his wife's face haunting his memory. He realized he was standing on the edge of a decision that could not be undone. Would you like the next section to show Tobias's inner collapse, the war between his humanity and the dark inheritance his son offers him? Tobias had known hunger before. He had known the ache of loss, the slow rot of despair, but nothing compared to the hunger gnawing at him now. It wasn't in his stomach, it was in his soul. Each night, the boy's whispers slipped into his dreams like a knife sliding between ribs. His wife's voice, woven with others, calling him by name. "Tobias, why fight what is already written?" Sometimes the whispers soothed him, sometimes they lashed at him, but always they pulled him closer, like a hook in the marrow. By day, he walked through the village like a ghost. No one looked at him with recognition anymore. The survivors of the massacre moved as one body, silent, their eyes glazed yet sharp, like wolves leashed by an unseen hand. When Tobias passed, they did not greet him. They bowed, not to him, but to the shadow that followed him, his son. He tried to cling to memory. He sat in the farmhouse with his wife's old shawl pressed to his face, breathing in the scent of lavender long since faded. He whispered prayers he had not spoken in years, but each word felt thin, brittle, a candle flame against a storm. The boy did not beg, did not argue. He simply waited. Each time Tobias faltered, each time the weight of isolation threatened to break him, the boy was there, offering not comfort, but inevitability. "Father," he said one evening as Tobias stared into the fire. "When you plowed these fields, you broke the earth to make it serve you. You did not ask its permission, you commanded it, and it obeyed. That is all I do. The only difference is that men are my soil." Tobias's throat tightened. He wanted to rage, to scream that men were not dirt, not beasts, but the words clung to ash in his mouth. Because the truth gnawed at him. Hadn't men always treated him the same way? As soil to be used, as hands to be worked, as a body to be buried when broken. The world had never spared him its cruelty. And now, through his son, the world itself bent. That night, Tobias dreamt not of God, not of mercy, but of standing at his son's side while the villagers knelt in the mud. His hands were steady, his heart unburdened, and for the first time since his wife's death, he woke without pain. But peace came with a cost. Would you like the next section to show the moment Tobias begins to yield? His first step into accepting the boy's darkness as his own inheritance. It began with a single step. Not a declaration, not a surrender, just a step. The boy had summoned the villagers to the square at dusk. No words were spoken, yet they gathered as if pulled by a tether buried in their chests. They knelt in the dirt, heads bowed, their breaths forming one ragged rhythm. Tobias stood at the edge of the circle, trembling. He told himself he was only there to watch, to bear witness, to remind himself of what he must resist. But when the boy extended a pale hand toward him, palm open, Tobias's body moved before his mind could resist. One step, then another, until he stood beside his son, facing the crowd of broken men and hollow-eyed women. The boy did not smile, yet something shifted in his gaze. Approval, recognition. He raised his hand, and the villagers lifted their heads in perfect unison. Tobias felt the pull of it, the current of control that hummed through his son, a power that wrapped around him like chains and wings at once. "Father," the boy whispered, though his voice carried across the square like thunder. "They await your word." Tobias's breath hitched. He wanted to run, to collapse, to claw out the voice that whispered his wife's tone through his son's lips. But the villagers' eyes burned into him, pleading, expecting, and something inside Tobias shifted, an old wound tearing open, releasing not blood, but hunger. He lifted his hand, mimicking his son. The crowd gasped, as if struck by a holy wind, and then they bowed lower, not just to the boy, to him. A heat spread through Tobias's chest, fierce and intoxicating. For the first time in his life, the world bent its knee. No overseer, no debtor, no priest wagging his finger. Him, Tobias Hale, the man who had buried his wife with his own hands, who had broken his back in fields of ungrateful soil, who had been treated as less than nothing. Now he was more than everything. When the crowd's whispers rose, Tobias did not understand the words, but he understood the power. He felt it filling him, coiling in his veins, binding him to his son. That night, when he returned to the farmhouse, Tobias did not sit alone in silence. He sat across from the boy, their eyes locked, and for the first time, he did not see a monster. He saw an heir, and the heir had chosen him. Would you like the next section to show how Tobias begins to act on this new role, testing the power himself, commanding the villagers for the first time? The first command slipped from Tobias's lips like a sin whispered in the dark. It was morning, the sky heavy with low clouds, when he stood once more before the gathered villagers. They were waiting, as they always did now, their bodies bent in submission, their eyes glassy yet fixed on him and the boy. Tobias had not intended to speak. He had promised himself he would stay silent, that he would let the boy's voice carry the weight of command. But when he looked at their faces, men who once mocked his poverty, women who once pitied his wife, something ancient stirred in him, a rage that had simmered for years, now sharpened into hunger. "You," he said, pointing to a farmer who had once stolen from his land. The man lifted his head, trembling. "Bring me your tools. Lay them at my doorstep. You will not touch the soil again until I tell you." The words felt strange at first, heavy in his mouth. But the villager did not hesitate. He rose, nodded once, and left to obey. No protest, no argument, just surrender. The others followed one by one, placing offerings at his feet. Tools, bread, even coins pulled from secret places. They piled them high like tributes to a king. And Tobias felt it, the current of obedience, the intoxicating swell of power surging not from his own strength but from their surrender. It was not belief, it was bondage, and he was the hand that held the chain. The boy watched him closely, his pale eyes unblinking. When the villagers dispersed, he spoke softly, his tone carrying a quiet satisfaction. "You see now, Father, you are no longer their equal. You are what they feared all along, what they prayed to and against in the same breath. You are the voice they cannot resist." That night, Tobias sat at the table, the offerings spread before him. He ran his hands across the tools, the bread, the coins. Each object was meaningless on its own, but together they formed something he had never possessed before: dominion. For the first time since the boy's birth, Tobias did not wonder whether his son was a curse or a blessing. He only wondered how much more the world could give if he demanded it. And in that moment, the last fragile thread of doubt inside him began to snap. Would you like the next section to show how the villagers' obedience turns darker, where Tobias commands them to do something cruel, testing the full reach of his power? The Whitlock household became a theater of ritual, where daily life blurred with the grotesque. Every morning, Eleanor was awakened not by sunlight, but by the metallic clang of chains echoing through the halls. Tobias Whitlock, gaunt and wild-eyed, had fashioned his own rituals, binding the house into a private cathedral of suffering. The dining room table was cleared of food and replaced with relics, bones, cracked mirrors, children's dolls with missing eyes. Eleanor was forced to sit across from him as he recited passages of scripture in a voice so hollow it sounded less like prayer and more like a curse. She soon discovered that the house itself conspired against her. Windows had been nailed shut, doors locked from the outside. A child's laughter would sometimes drift through the corridors, though no child lived within those walls. Eleanor learned not to ask where the sound came from. At night, Tobias would speak to the empty air, as though addressing unseen guests. He laughed, argued, and pleaded with voices Eleanor could not hear. But she felt them. Shadows pooling in the corners of the room, shapes lingering in the mirrors, waiting for her to look too long. It was in the cellar that Eleanor saw the true nature of Tobias's devotions. He brought her down into the earth, lantern in hand, revealing walls carved with names, hundreds of them etched into stone with a trembling hand. Some she recognized from the town's graveyard, others she had never heard, but each name carried the weight of the dead. Tobias whispered that these names were owed, that the house itself demanded recognition. At the center of the cellar stood a wooden chair bound with ropes, stained dark with something Eleanor dared not identify. Fear had become her second skin, but so had defiance. She began to notice the cracks in Tobias's madness. His hands shook when he tried to write new no's, mes. His prayers stumbled into gibberish. His shadows did not always answer him. Eleanor knew then that madness, no matter how powerful, could fracture, and when it did, it left behind openings wide enough for escape. Still, the house pressed against her spirit, its walls whispering that she would never leave. Eleanor lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, telling herself she would outlast him. She had no choice, for in this house of broken rituals and whispered names, survival was not just rebellion, it was an act of war.